Thank you for that introduction, Andrew. I really look forward to, when we're done, all of your questions about Genesis 22 that we didn't get to a minute ago. I hope that I can thoroughly answer all of those. No, I'm not even going to talk about that probably here. So, no, I really appreciate this. I know if you're like me at this point of the day, I mean, we have had our wagons loaded up with such good insights, haven't we? From these scholars who've come and shared some insights with us. I can't wait to think about how to apply some of what we've heard throughout these sessions. So here at the end of the day, if you're like me, my brain is kind of like full already. Thankfully, I'm a practitioner. I'm a preacher, and so I'm going to stay in my lane and just try to stay really practical here in this session as we think about some preaching tips and sermon starters. So what I want to do is take just the first maybe 10 minutes or so, and I just want to do some really practical, kind of general wisdom for preaching. You know, I know we have some in here who have been preaching for a long, long time. We have others of us who are aspiring to preach. And so some of this that we go through at the first part of this, you may think, I mean, that is so elementary. Why do they get this guy up here to talk about this? But some of this, I'm thinking, might be a real help to you as well. So the first part, I just want to talk through some general wisdom for preaching. And then the back half of our time together, I actually want to give you a handout of some material that I've done that I worked through on a Genesis series. And so instead of sermon starters, maybe just giving you a look at what someone else has done, you can, you know, like we always say, take what works and spit out the bones and move on. So maybe that'll be helpful to you as well. So that's how we'll kind of structure our time here over the next few minutes. So we'll just kind of dive right in. Some general wisdom here for preaching. First, I just want to talk for a few minutes about this idea, and it will play into where we go with this material as we talk about Genesis in just a few moments. But I want to talk about the importance of knowing your own voice, okay? Knowing the sound of your own voice. So much of preaching is about your voice. And as I think about my preaching today, in my mid-40s, and I compare that with my preaching from 10 years ago or certainly 20 years ago, I think one of the greatest differences would be that I have a better understanding of myself. I have a better understanding of my voice. When I was younger, when I first started in ministry, I was a youth minister, and every time I would speak to our youth group, I found myself, I was just copying the mannerisms of my youth minister. And I would also, just rip off his material and do that. But I'm talking about just the embodiment of being there. I had to have that mental model of someone else. And we all do that to a certain degree. And that's a part of this. But God doesn't need me to be a copycat. And I think there's a real temptation in our line of work, if we're not careful, to kind of gravitate toward that. We all probably can think of individuals who have paid a pretty stiff penalty for just outright plagiarizing sermons, That's certainly not, what we're called to be. God doesn't need me to be a copycat. He wants me to be authentically me, and He's given me an authentic voice for preaching. And so I think that's really important. Years ago, one of my professors had us read a book. Maybe you're familiar with it. Robert Reed, The Four Voices of Preaching. Any of you ever heard this book? Maybe a couple of you. I'm not really recommending it to you. You can read it if you want to. I didn't find it to be incredibly helpful, but he identifies these four voices for preaching. And he says every preacher kind of gravitates toward one of these four voices. The first one is the teaching voice. Lots of explanation from God's Word, preaching as argument, so just coming and teaching out of the text or arguing a particular theological point out of the text. That's the teaching voice. The encouraging voice seeks to create an encounter with God, so there are more stories there, maybe less of an emphasis on content. The sage voice, Reed says, this is communicating wisdom. It's a bit more oblique than the teacher or the encourager. You think of Fred Craddock and his inductive sermon. There's a lot of sage voice that's baked into that, if you're familiar with Craddock. And then the fourth voice was the testifying voice, which is more of like the guide at at your side, helping people to engage with the theological tradition of the testifying church. So those four voices are the ones that Reed identifies. And I tell you that because, the book didn't really help me out all that much because I grew up in the Church of Christ. And just about every sermon that I ever heard growing up came out of that teaching voice. And every time that I even thought about what preaching would be like for me, it was in that line of the teaching voice. I learned early on as a young minister that if I was going to have a leg to stand on as I stood before people and tried to teach and encourage and do all of this, that I'd better have some sort of textual mooring there to be able to speak credibly to people who've been following Jesus a lot longer than I'd even been alive. One of the first sermons I ever preached, I was the youth minister at a little church in Kingsport, Tennessee, and the preacher was out of town. And so, what happens when you're, the youth minister there, I got to preach on Memorial Day or whatever it was when he didn't want to be there. And so I'm up, kind of preaching and doing my thing, and I finished, and this older brother comes up to me, and he was really kind. He wasn't unkind, but he was just saying, hey, you did a great job. But he said, how old are you? And I said, well, I'm 22, whatever age I was right out of school. He said, boy, I got socks older than you. Just keep after it. He was trying to encourage me, but I thought, wow, all right, this is where I am in East Tennessee. So to have a leg to stand on, I learned I needed to really rely on the Word of God and to teach out of the text, right? Something else that I've learned that, again, I think it would be helpful for you, I think it's really important for my preaching voice to match my regular voice. You know what I mean by that? To have this authenticity between those two. I think it's a major turnoff to people when we use an entirely different voice for preaching than we do in any other context. So again, I know this guy, and he's a good minister, so don't get me wrong, but whenever he's in the pulpit, when he's preaching, he has this voice, and it's, turn with me in the Word of God, and it's this voice that, he has. And then at other time, any other context when you talk to him, he's like, what's up? Hey, man, how's it going? I'm like, there's just this disconnect between his preaching voice and his regular walking around voice, and I just think people see that. They hear that. And so my critique is that guy doesn't know the sound of his own voice, the authentic voice that God has given him for preaching. And so my question for us would be, do you know the sound of your own voice? Maybe your book like Reed's book would help you. Maybe some other things that we talk about here would help you try to find your own unique and God-given voice. For me, knowing my own voice means acknowledging that I'm a teacher evangelist at heart. Okay, so those two things are the way I would describe my own teaching style, my own preaching style. Some preachers are very pastoral by nature. My mentor, Gary Bradley, who preached before me at Mayfair for years, he's such a gentleman, and he's so pastoral. He just preaches to people's needs, and he does that in a way that, for me, it's just next level, the way he's able to do that. Others are more fiery. They're able to step on your toes in a good kind of way. We all know preachers who are able to do that. Some are just natural storytellers by nature. For me, my approach is to be that teacher evangelist. And what I mean by that is, in just about every sermon, I want to use Scripture to point people to the good news. Okay, I preach in Huntsville, Alabama. So between the NASA engineers and the defense contractors and the literal rocket scientists who are in my audience, I have a lot of linear thinkers. Okay, so the teaching voice really plays well to that linear kind of thinker that we tend to have a lot of. But a lot of times those linear thinkers are so accustomed to reading for information. They'll just drill down. They just I want all the information. Some of our sessions here today, we, again, have had such great interaction with the information, okay? That's great. That's really, really good. But sometimes I found that for people like my people back home who were They love that information. Sometimes they struggle with the application of that. And if you ask the question, okay, we've spent an hour talking about this Hebrew word or this Greek word, or here's the cultural setting of Thessalonica or whatever, and we try to ask a question like, okay, so how is any of that connected back to the good news? There's a lot of blank stares, because in our minds, in their minds, and even my own sometimes, we lose sight of that for sake of the pursuit of the information. Pursuing the information is a great thing, right? But as preachers, we have to remember that we're not just called to stand up every week and give a book report. Like the calling is much, much greater than that. We're called to point people to the transformative power of the Word. We're called to point people toward this transformative encounter with Jesus, the living Word that animates the written Word, all of those kinds of things. So for me, I keep knowing like who I am and knowing my own voice kind of helps hold my feet to the fire on how I want to approach the task of preaching this particular text. So for me, a true evangelist is someone who can help you hear the good news even if they have bad news that they have to share. There's some bad news places in the text, right? There are a lot of places where if we're going to talk about sin, we're going to talk about wrath, we're going to talk about a troubling text like Genesis 22. There's some things there that we're feeling as we read a text like that or 1,000 others. But a true evangelist is somebody who can help you hear the good news even in the midst of a bad news text. And I think that's what we have to remember. I just made a decision years ago as a preacher. So again, I defer all of this to language scholars and those whose training is so far surpasses ours when it comes to dealing with the text responsibly. Okay, but I'm not one of those guys. Like I'm a preacher, so there's times when we're faced with these places of interpretation, right? You have to decide, okay, to interpret a text this way or this way. And we come to those places in our ministries. I decided years ago, tell me what you think about it during the Q&A, but I decided that for me, if I come to one of those places where, the scholarship is clearly divided and you could pay your money and make your choice, right? I'm going to choose every single time the more redemptive reading, okay? Because I think all of this is supposed to be good news. And you could debate, okay, what does redemptive reading mean? We pick an issue and we can kind of unpack that a little bit. But I'm just saying for you, or for me, understanding that all of this is supposed to be good news helps me to come back to what I feel like my calling is as evangelist, as one who wants to articulate the message of good news for our people. And sometimes that's harder to do than we make it sound, because we'll get lost in the information, or we'll get lost in the cultural implications of this, or we'll get lost in the questions, or preaching to people's needs or whatever, instead of remembering that it's all supposed to be good news. Also this, and then we'll move on. I'm spending a lot of time on the first point. Here's why I think all this is important. For me, knowing myself helps me to set my own expectation for the sermon rather than being controlled by the expectations of the audience. What I mean by that is this. Most people want their preacher to be equal parts Bible scholar, self-help guru, stand-up comedian, culture warrior, folksy storyteller, and gifted orator. And if you could do all of that in 22 minutes, please, once a week, they'll be just tickled pink. That is a lot of pressure, That's a lot of pressure. And even if you do all of that, they're just going to go watch, Francis Chan or whoever else online who's going to do it better than you anyway. So like that, there's a lot of that pressure that we feel. And I guess we can't ever get away from that, completely. But for me, knowing myself, knowing my own voice helps me set the expectation for the sermon rather than being controlled by the expectations of everybody else, okay? We'll go through these next two a little more quickly. I want to talk about this too, just have a captive audience with preachers. I think we just need to say we need to respect the discipline of preaching. Not to imply that you don't, but maybe this is just a reminder, okay? Maybe you're just getting started with this, and maybe you need to hear this. But preaching is a craft, and just like any other craft, it requires discipline, and the discipline of study is probably first and foremost when it comes to that. And again, we touched on it a minute ago, but becoming lazy when it comes to the discipline of study, that is just bad. You get into a lot of bad habits. Half-baked sermons, the temptation to borrow from somebody else and not properly footnote that. I've had people who've been so upset at me because I footnoted this person, preacher X or scholar or this or that, and they come to me and they're just like almost irate that they assume maybe I'm baptizing everything that person ever said. But then when I say to them, well, I feel like I'm supposed to let you know that that idea wasn't original to me. This is my way of footnoting that for you. It sort of lets a little bit of the air out of the balloon, and even it sort of turns that anger into just maybe a little bit of respect. They still may think you shouldn't have quoted from that guy or whatever, but at the very least, I'm not passing off some idea as if it's my own when it's not. And I can tell you there have been times in my preaching where I have not had that level of integrity. And so I think it's incumbent upon us. Those to me, that's like the little things, right? That's being faithful in the little things, and what does the Lord say about that when we're faithful in those little things? So that's to me like really, really important. A big part of knowing myself is knowing my best time for sermon prep. For me, sermon prep time, the best time for me is the morning. I've reached this age where an hour in the morning is worth 2 hours in the afternoon. I'm just fresher. I got more to give. So if I can take my time and study and use that energy and that focus in the morning time, it pays off for me in a big, big way. By the time I get to the afternoon, I'm not as sharp. I'm a little more fidgety. I'm antsy. I'm kind of like you. We've been sitting a while. You're probably ready to get up and move around. Like, is the coffee pot still on? I get that when it comes to the afternoon. So that's why I try to schedule as many meetings and counseling sessions with people and everything like that in the afternoon. You may be the complete opposite. I have friends who preach and they're like, I don't do anything, like that before lunch. And maybe you hit your power, hour right after, lunchtime. For me, I do 90% of my sermon prep before lunch. And then all the other things I have to do, I try to push to the back, But that requires this discipline. It requires guarding your schedule. For me, Tuesdays and Thursdays, those mornings, I beat everything else to my schedule by blocking those things out. And if I can, if something comes up and there's a funeral on Tuesday, okay, all bets are off, okay? But the discipline of having that study time blocked out, for me, there's just no substitute for it. And the worst feeling in the world is when you've had one of those weeks. You know what I'm talking about. And one thing came up after another, and it was all urgent. You couldn't leave anything else out there, right? But your study time had to kind of take a pass, and you get into the pulpit, and you don't have your best effort to give to these people who've shown up, and they're hungry to hear a word from God, Like, that is the worst feeling in the world. So we have to be disciplined to keep from getting to that place. The sermon may still be a dud. I've preached plenty of them, but at least it's not for lack of preparation. The ones that are the duds are like, man, in my head, that was really good, but out here, it just was flat. Okay, but, it's a lot like cooking, Everybody has their own favorite meals. And so, week to week, you're probably not going to, feed everybody their favorite meal. Maybe they don't love Italian. Maybe they don't love Mexican. Maybe they don't love your style on that one. Maybe they don't like 3 points. They want something more inductive or whatever. But the best thing you can do is just say, look, you show up every Sunday and I'll not give you leftovers. Okay? At the very least, we're making this thing from scratch. And we're giving it our best effort. That requires some discipline. I don't have time because I need to take this point to heart myself, but I have a whole big thing on here about the discipline of editing and how that's really important. So I'm going to model that and just kind of skip ahead here and keep going. Last thing I'll say about this, because I do want to get to the stuff on Genesis too. I think it requires a real discipline to say, this is the time I have, Lord, for this sermon, and when I get to the end of that, I'm going to lay it down. I'm going to walk away from it, okay? If you do something different than I do or what I'm about to say, that is, everybody has to kind of find what works for them. But it pains me because I talk to a lot of my friends and, Saturday afternoon, Saturday night, their families are like hostage. They've got to just stay home and stay quiet, or they're not able to go do anything because dad's got to finish writing his sermon or work on his PowerPoint or his keynote or whatever. And man, I just think we need to repent of that. There comes a point in time where we say, okay, this is the time I have to devote to this, and I'm going to trust that God's going to show up. I'll trust that the Holy Spirit will meet me here too. So I'm not trying to talk out of both sides of my mouth because I just harped on the importance of study, but there are times where we can go overboard with that, And the people in your pews that are dealing with cancer, or struggling to pay their bills, or estranged from their kids, man, I'm sorry, they don't care about the color of your keynote slide, and they're sure not going to be wowed by the font that you selected, I mean, they're not. Some of the things that we care about, I'm part of preachers groups, and we have these discussions, and we spent a whole thing talking about which font is best on. I'm like, I've got people with cancer. They don't care about that. So for me, when I finish the sermon on Thursday, that's my goal. I have Tuesday, Thursday, and I usually have a general idea of what I'm trying to do. But when I finish up on Thursday, I have to write discussion questions for our small group. A lot of them use the sermon material there. So I write that, and I send that off. And then for me, this is the way I have to discipline myself. I don't touch it again until Sunday morning. All right? And I'm telling you, to first try that, it was like, doing the high wire act without a net. I was so worried because I so wanted to go running to my notes on, Friday or Saturday, but I realized I wasn't giving my family the best of myself. And so I repented of that, and I stopped doing it. So when I get up on Sunday morning, I do my final review, and that's when I develop my keynote slides or PowerPoint, whatever it is that you use. And if you look at my stuff, you're like, yeah, I can tell. That did not take you very long to work on. I get it. I'm not trying to just blow your doors off with the multimedia, okay? But when I do my final review on Sunday morning, that's when I build any kind of slides that I have. I try to limit it to text and one or two kind of key point slides, all right? And that's when I'll do my final editing too, because I'll realize in that whole process that, okay, this story that I really wanted to tell, that is so funny, and so it really has nothing to do with the point that I'm trying to make, And so that requires a lot of discipline. But if I know kind of like where I'm trying to go with that message, then it makes that editing a lot easier. Final part of this is I just encourage you to inventory every story. I had to have something on here that rhymed, and it was kind of preacher sounding. So especially for you younger guys, you'll probably think, I'll always remember that cute thing that my kids said when they were 2 years old and we were going to Target or whatever. And I'm just telling you, by the time they're teenagers like mine are, you will not be remembering that. There'll be a whole other set of issues that'll be at the forefront of your mind. And so I keep an inventory of this. I use Evernote, but I know a lot of my friends use Google Docs or whatever. You're probably doing this already, but when you get a story that really, really works, you need to write that thing down and use it in so many different contexts. Jesus does this. He's a master storyteller, but he doesn't just tell those stories one time. You think he only told a few of those stories one time? No, it's recorded in there one time, but again, I'm making an interpretation, okay? So forgive me, but I can tell you, if I wrote the parable of the lost son, I'm telling that every time I preach, that's a good one. Everybody remembers that. And so keeping an inventory of those, I think will be helpful to you. Just real quick on sermon construction, maybe this is helpful to you as well. You stare at that blank page and you're like, okay, where do I start? This is a practice I've gotten into, and this is what I do every time. I begin every sermon with two things at the top of the page. One is this line, sermon thesis, just a one-sentence summary of what I'm trying to say. Holds my feet to the fire. If I ever get off on here and I'm trying, again, this story, that would be great. If it doesn't match that thesis statement, then I need to table it. I keep another file for stuff that I haven't used. Maybe it's great fodder for the discussion questions or whatever, but I heard Randy Harris say this one time. Somebody asked Randy, how many points should a good sermon have? And in his kind of funny way, he said, well, most of the times I would settle for just one. That's, rather than a pointless sermon, just kind of stay in your lane on this central message that you're trying to communicate. And then number 2, a list of the texts that I plan on preaching. I talked about having a good inventory for some of your stories. I think you should also keep an inventory of the texts that you find yourself preaching through. So the first thing on Monday morning, I email my administrative assistant and I give her all the scriptures that I referenced in the previous sermon. She adds it to a file, and every month or so she sends it to me. She'll print it out or send me a digital file of it or whatever. And it's really helpful to look at year over year what I've been preaching, and just as importantly, what I've not been preaching. We probably think like, oh yeah, I just did that series on Isaiah or whatever. You go look at it, it was like 5 years ago. That happened to me recently. I thought, yeah, I've preached from the Old Testament all the time. And I went back and looked and I realized, no, I hadn't. I stay in certain places. There's certain verses that everybody has a canon within the canon they talk about, the places where you're really comfortable. Maybe you're a Sermon on the Mount guy, maybe, there's a passage that you particularly have studied, or you've taken a grad class on this, you've got your notes, so you go back to, this place or whatever. But I'm not saying that we ought to give all these texts ought to be on equal footing, what we just heard today. I think you probably ought to preach Genesis 12 a lot more than you preach Obadiah or whatever, right? Okay, so, but you should also not go decades without ever talking about any of the prophets. And so that leads me into this stuff with Genesis. I realized a couple years ago that I hadn't touched on anything out of the Pentateuch in a long, long time, and that was negligent on my part. So I developed a series entitled The Gospel According to Genesis, and that's actually what I want to share with you here right now as we wind down my part before we get to the Q&A. Could you help me out? I printed way more copies than I need, but if you could just kind of distribute those on this side, if you do the same here. This is yours to keep. You keep up with it, however you want to. But I wanted you to see kind of an overview of a series that I developed a couple of years ago on Genesis. So I've actually come back to this recently because I'm currently using Genesis as the foundational basis for a series I'm currently preaching as we work through some biblical worldview stuff, talking about developing a biblical worldview. So, Genesis is going to be one of those places. Certainly these foundational narratives early on in Genesis, the Genesis 12, Genesis 15, these covenant passages that talk about Abraham and his faith, Genesis 22. Again, I know we chased the rabbit around there on that a few moments ago, but these are foundational texts for our faith. And, if we're going to understand ourselves and what the Scriptures have to say, we begin with this foundational truth that understanding ourselves actually involves understanding God first. How does the story begin? In the beginning, God. He's the central actor. He's the central character there. So just kind of real quickly walking through this, you can see this is from January, February 2020. So I've kept the dates on here. Every sermon series that I preach, you're probably doing something similar, okay? I'm just showing you what works for me, all right? But I have this 5-column kind of approach that I'll build every sermon series in. And the dates, the titles, the texts, the notes, and then any kind of miscellaneous, whatever's going on in the church calendar. This one, we had Martin Luther King weekend is on page 2 on the back there. And then our budget Sunday was February 2nd. It normally takes us that long to get our act together on, being able to present our budget. We do that the first Sunday in February. It's kind of become our norm. But I kind of wanted to show you what I've done. So again, teacher evangelist, for me, the important thing is trying to find a way to not just tell these stories, but to do so in a way that highlights the good news. And so I like this idea of, the gospel being identified in these key passages in the Old Testament. So I had 8 weeks to work with, given our calendar and the other things that we had going on. There are a lot of other, you can tell, to use our language of gaps, there's a lot of gaps here, a lot of stuff I just couldn't get to, okay? We weren't trying to be exhaustive, but I wanted to select some key passages where we could really hunker down and talk about the essence of the good news. And so you begin here with, Genesis 1 and 2. the gospel according to Genesis it begins with the story of a God who creates. He creates all things, but he creates humanity in his image, in his likeness. And so what does that mean? What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Well, whatever it means there in Genesis 1, 26 and 27, it has something to do with community. It has something to do with male and female. He says that he creates man in his image, male and female. He created them. And so if we're going to talk about preaching through Genesis, right here from the jump, we have some really powerful touch points to talk about some of the key issues in our culture today. So if you have people in your church who are looking for community, you have people in your neighborhood who would rather go to Starbucks than go to church because they find some level of conversation and community there that they don't find everywhere else. Well, the scriptures speak to that. To me, that's part of what it means to be made in the image of a triune God. You have people in your community, in your church, who are asking questions about gender right now. Well, if we look at the biblical narrative there in Genesis 1, we see that gender is a category of creation. So that begs a question, what does it mean to be made male and female, to be made in the image and likeness of God, to be an embodied person, Genesis speaks to that right there on page 1. So, it doesn't mean that everybody has to agree on every single, point of minutia on that particular hot button issue. But I think people today, I know in our church, probably yours as well, they're just kind of hungry to know, okay, can you point me to some places in God's Word that talks about, identity and sexuality and gender and, what does it mean to be an embodied person? So going to the Genesis narrative, that is, if you're going to address those things from a biblical perspective, you have to go to Genesis, right? That doesn't mean you have to always be preaching a series on Genesis every year. I mean, I think it would be a great idea to do that if you haven't lately. But at the very least, we're going to use Genesis in a foundational way, coming back to it to interpret what it means to live faithfully in our day today. Isn't that kind of like what Paul does in Romans and Galatians, I mean, so that's, to me, a key place to begin. I loved preaching this in January because our people are making a commitment to read their Bibles more then anyway, and so just meeting them where they are. I usually try to do a textual series to start the year anyway. But to do this on January 1st, 2020, of course, we didn't know what was going to happen the rest of the year there. But this series begins with this idea of a God who creates. And I've tried to carry that same kind of approach through the rest of the series. You can see there on January 12th, we're talking about a God who makes promises. So we get to, the story of sin entering into the world. And the question is, how does God respond to all of that? And he responds by making promises. He's a covenant God. Among all the other things we can say about the Noah narrative, that's certainly one thing that we can emphasize. He's a covenant God. I won't read all of this to you, but I do want to point out a couple other things here as we kind of wind this session down. On January 19th, the gospel according to Genesis, when we trust God. So you get the Genesis 12 story there. And, to me, these are places where a lot of our people, they already kind of have this understanding of Abraham. They think they know the story, but there are some key places where I think we can work to make these biblical characters really relatable. So I love kind of just thinking about what that must have been like for Abraham and his relationship with Sarah. To come home and to say, honey, we're moving. And what was Sarah's response, You come home and say, hey, we're moving. Okay, where are we going? My wife's first question would be, do they have a Target? Do they have a Starbucks? But where are we moving? Well, I don't really know where we're going. God just showed up and told me that we're supposed to leave home and leave our families and go, and he's going to show us exactly where it is we're supposed to go. What would happen if you came home and said that? What would my wife say? What would your wife say if you came home and said that? There would some wife among us would say, you will do anything to get away from my mother, won't you? And it's little things like that help make Sarah this relatable figure as well. here in this series. We talked a little bit about her story. I think it's maybe week 5, where she's the one who laughs. And there's this snarky kind of like laughter, this jaded bitterness about Sarah. If we're not careful, we'll tell the story of Genesis like it's just a little boys' club. That it's all Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Joseph gets all this press in the back half. But there's some women. There's some like strong women of faith here in the Genesis story. And Sarah, even though she's kind of bitter and she's laughing, her story demonstrates faithfulness, right? Demonstrates faithfulness on God's part, because the response is, well, is anything too impossible, too extraordinary, too wonderful for the Lord to do? I love the story of Hagar here in Genesis 16, where you have an opportunity to talk about, she describes God as the God who sees me. So there's a chance to kind of speak to some of these characters who aren't quite as familiar to our audiences, So if you do Genesis 12, people know that one. You do Adam and Eve and creation, people know that one. You do Genesis 16, Hagar, it's kind of like, okay, I kind of remember her story. What happens there? And she is able to say, you are the one who sees me. There are people in your church, this is the language of our day, who are asking about, like, does anybody see me? They want to be seen. To be seen means to be known. It means to be accepted. It's very like, it's very much an affirming kind of message that people are looking for today. Okay, all right. I'm not sure that we always want to baptize everything that's done in the name of affirming, everything about someone's behavior today. All right, but still, the point is well taken. That this is the language of our culture. Does anybody see me? And Hagar demonstrates, the way she speaks of God, He is the one who has seen me, who's heard my plight. It gives us an opportunity to preach and speak into some of that as well. This on the back page here, just kind of winding down the gospel according to Genesis. When we wrestle, that was the week we told the story of Jacob. Throughout his life, one of the best things you can say about him is that he's really tenacious. He's kind of holding on to the heel of his brother there. He's holding on to God here this night when he's wrestling with him as well. And really, that's about his only redeeming quality. But God shows up in that darkness. And if you have a story to tell along those lines, there are people in your church who, and you know this, but just to be able to speak into their own wrestling experience, their own darkness. This is the week I talked about the death of my own mother, and how, for me, as I read this story, you've got Jacob. He's always been a mama's boy, and he's far from home. Really, his mother is the only home he's ever had. And he's about to go and interact with his brother again. And so he sends everybody, this is kind of a cowardly move. He sends everybody else ahead of him. Maybe it's cowardly, maybe it's not. I don't know. It's an interpretation again. But he sends everybody ahead, and he's like by himself there. You remember the story, right? And then this mysterious figure shows up and wrestles with him through the night. And only at the very end you find out it's God. And he's like, it's this weird, almost vampire thing. Like the sun's coming up. Hey, I've got to go. I need to go run the universe here. I can't be out in the daylight. And Jacob's like, no, I can't let you go. Is he at? Maybe unless you bless me or something. And so then God reaches down and dislocates his hip. How's that for a blessing? Maybe that's not the blessing. I don't know. But he says, you are now Israel, for you contend with God. And the way I picture it, Jacob kind of limps away from this experience, but he's wrestled with God and he's lived. And so I told the story about when my own mother passed away, and what it was like to meet God in this dark place where I was far from home, far from the one who, at that time in my life, I was a teenager. She loved me more than anybody else I'd ever known. And there's some aspects of that particular part of my story I'm not super proud of. Just like I'm sure Jacob had a lot of things in his life he wasn't really proud of. And yet God met me in the darkness and engaged and refused to let go, because he's the faithful God. Back to our question, somebody was asking a minute ago, maybe the whole question isn't like, about Abraham. Maybe it's the God question. What do we glean? What do we learn about God from this particular passage? And Genesis provides so many of those places. There are a lot of other stories that, if I were to preach this again, I think I would include a week about Leah. Leah with weak eyes, whatever that means, She's clearly not the looker that her sister is, And yet, her blessing, through her, we have the line, L-I-N-E, of Judah, right? From whom comes the Lion of Judah. But you have to get to Genesis 49 before you even figure out that Judah's like part of this, And she's just like this, so easily overlooked throughout the narrative. And yet, it is her line. God uses her and her line in a way that blesses. If I was preaching it again, I'd probably also do like a messy story like Judah and Tamar. Have you ever preached Judah and Tamar? I'm a coward when it comes. I have not done that one yet. But I think I would. I think I would just to say, even in a messy, like the mess of this. I mean, you can imagine the questions. Okay, how do you make sense? I don't know. This thing is a mess. And I think that's the point. The point is that God is faithful even in this messy family that he's called. He's working with them where they are to try to bring about blessing and transformation. I don't know. I can think of some families in my church that would benefit from that kind of message. Anyway, this is just my latest attempt to preach my way through some of these key stories that we've heard about today. So I appreciate your attention.